This happened about 8 or 9 months after I moved into my very first house. At the time I was 24, fresh out of college with a decent job, finally feeling like life was starting to settle into place. Everything about that house seemed normal. Until one night, when I realized something was very wrong. The only thing you really need to know about the place is that it had a huge basement. And when I say huge, I mean far bigger than I actually needed. I mostly used it for storage. The previous owners had divided the space using plywood walls and exposed framing. So instead of one big open room, the basement was broken into several smaller sections. Right at the bottom of the stairs, there was a main area. Past that was the laundry space. Further in was what looked like it used to be a workshop. And at the very back, there was this strange storage room full of old shelving. The layout had a strange effect. You couldn't actually see the entire basement from any one place. The walls created narrow passages and corners, almost like a small maze underground. When I first toured the house, I remember thinking that was kind of cool. Later on, I realized it really wasn't. One weeknight, I carried a basket of laundry downstairs. That was pretty much the only reason I ever went into the basement. As soon as I opened the door at the top of the stairs, I noticed something unusual. The basement lights were already on. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I must have forgotten to turn them off a few days earlier. It didn't seem like a big deal. The lights down there were old yellow incandescent bulbs that cast a dim glow over everything. Even when they were on, the basement always felt a little dark. I had never bothered replacing them. I started walking down the stairs, and within seconds, everything escalated so suddenly that I barely had time to process what was happening. I reached the bottom of the stairs and began heading toward the laundry area. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Instinctively, I turned my head and immediately locked eyes with a man. He was crouching behind one of the folding tables I had set up near the far corner of the basement. The shock of it almost made me drop the laundry basket. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing, because there was only one explanation. There was a stranger hiding in my basement. Neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, and the way he looked at me sent a cold wave straight down my spine. His clothes were filthy, his hair messy, like he had crawled out of some dark place no one was supposed to find. Then, suddenly, he stood up and ran, not toward me, deeper into the basement, toward the partitioned rooms in the back. That was the moment my body snapped out of its frozen state. I started backing toward the stairs, but I had already wasted too much time. Because just before I reached the first step, every light in the basement went out, instantly. Until that moment, I had never been down there with the lights off, and I had no idea how dark it would actually be. Not dim, not shadowy, completely pitch black. The kind of darkness where you can't see your own hands. I tried to keep moving toward where I thought the stairs were. I assumed I knew my own basement well enough. But I was wrong. Within seconds, my foot caught on something and I crashed to the floor. When I stood back up, I was completely disoriented. My heart was racing, and my brain felt like it had stopped working. My phone was upstairs on the kitchen counter. No light, no flashlight, just darkness, and the knowledge that someone else was somewhere down there with me. In a panic, I started screaming. My thought was simple: if I sounded crazy enough, maybe whoever had broken in would get scared and leave. But the thing that happened next made the situation infinitely worse. From somewhere across the basement, another scream answered mine. His scream, and it sounded far more terrifying than mine. We were both yelling into the darkness. Two people, somewhere in the same basement, unable to see each other, but fully aware the other was there. Eventually, I stopped screaming, and he stopped too. The basement fell silent again. I had no choice but to start moving by touch, sliding my hands along walls and furniture, trying to find the stairs. Then I heard movement behind me. He was moving too. The sound was getting closer. And in that moment, a chilling realization crossed my mind. He seemed to know the layout of my own basement better than I did. I kept moving, hoping I would find the stairs before he found me. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop, breathing, right behind me. I genuinely thought he was about to grab me. After what felt like an eternity, my hand finally touched the wooden base of the staircase. I grabbed the railing and started running up. But before I could reach the second step, something grabbed my ankle. I lost my balance instantly. My head struck the railing and I fell all the way back down to the basement floor. I still couldn't see him, but I could feel him pulling me away from the stairs. I kicked wildly, trying anything to break free. One of my kicks must have connected with something. I twisted, scrambled, and managed to tear myself away. Then I ran. Somehow I found the stairs again before he could reach me. I bolted up, burst through the basement door, and slammed it shut behind me. But the nightmare wasn't over. That door didn't have a lock, so the only thing I could do was press my entire body against it and hope it was enough. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps pounding up the basement stairs. Then, crash. Something slammed into the door with incredible force. The door burst open for a split second before I shoved it closed again with everything I had. But he kept throwing himself against it, over and over. I even ripped off my socks so my feet wouldn't slip on the floor as I pushed against the door. Because in that moment, I knew something very simple. If that door opened, things could turn out very badly. And then, suddenly, the impact stopped. I heard footsteps heading back down the basement stairs. That was my chance. I ran to grab my phone and immediately called the police while still holding the door shut. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. One of the basement windows had been forced open from the outside. Nothing in the house had been stolen. One of the officers suggested something that honestly made the whole situation even more disturbing. He said the intruder might have been using my basement as a place to hide or even live. And judging by how quickly he turned off the lights, he clearly knew exactly where the switch was, which wasn't in an obvious spot. I moved out of that house about 4 months later, and thinking back on that night now, there's one thought that still sends chills down my spine. That man didn't seem surprised to see me. Almost like he had been prepared for someone to come down there eventually. And if things had played out just a little differently, I might not be here telling this story today. If you've ever experienced something strange in your own home, feel free to share it in the comments below. I always find those stories interesting to read. This happened when I was 14. I'm in my 30s now, so this was almost 20 years ago. My parents had to travel out of state for a wedding, and even though I was technically old enough to stay home alone, they still didn't feel comfortable leaving me by myself. The plan was simple. My older sister, who was in college about an hour away, would stay with me for the weekend. But the moment my parents left, she texted me saying she had a party to go to and wouldn't make it. Honestly, I didn't care. A whole weekend alone sounded great, and I definitely wasn't about to tell my parents and risk them finding someone else to watch. Me. The house itself wasn't in a bad area either. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood filled with families, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. So that night was completely normal. I spent hours playing Halo in the living room, something I usually wasn't allowed to do for that long. Everything felt calm and ordinary, until just after midnight. I was stretched out on the couch when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere outside in the backyard. At first, it sounded like something lightly hitting the side of the house. I assumed it was probably a tree branch or something blowing in the wind, so I didn't think much about it. But a few minutes later, the tapping came again. Same sound, same rhythm. Then it started moving. The tapping slowly traveled along the side of the house, almost like whatever was making it was walking around outside. That's when I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. My stomach started to tighten with that strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then the noise stopped completely. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself it was probably just some animal running around outside, so I turned the TV back on. But about 20 minutes later, another sound made my heart jump. Another tapping, except this time, it was coming from below me, from the basement. The living room sat directly above the basement, so there was no mistaking it. Our basement wasn't finished either, just bare concrete floors with a small kitchenette in the corner. It wouldn't have been impossible for some raccoon or stray cat to get in through one of the windows. At least, that's what I told myself as I stood up and walked toward the basement door. I didn't want to check. Not at all. But I needed to convince myself nothing was wrong. The basement had several windows that led directly outside, so it made sense that some animal could have gotten in. I tried repeating that thought in my head as I slowly opened the basement door and stood at the top of the stairs. Below me was complete darkness. The tapping was louder now, every few seconds, echoing through the basement. For some reason, I called out into the dark. "Hello?" The tapping stopped instantly. That was the moment my stomach dropped, because if it had just been an animal, it wouldn't have reacted like that. I knew the light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, and there was absolutely no chance I was going down there. So instead, I slowly closed the door until it was almost shut, leaving only a narrow crack. I slid my hand through the opening with my phone, aiming it toward the basement window where the sound seemed to come from. Then I turned on the flash, closed my eyes, and recorded a short video. A few seconds later, I pulled my hand back, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I opened the video on my phone. The footage was grainy and overexposed from the flash, but it only took a second for me to see it. There was someone standing inside the basement, right beneath one of the windows. I screamed and ran straight to my room. I locked the door and immediately called my dad. He stayed on the phone while he contacted the police. While I was still talking to them, I suddenly heard loud banging coming from the basement door downstairs. Over and over. Whoever had been down there was now trying to get upstairs into the house. After several heavy hits, the noise stopped. And then, finally, the police arrived. They searched the entire basement, but the person had already escaped through one of the windows. The officers even checked the yard, but whoever it was had completely disappeared into the night. Some things had been stolen from the basement. Nothing major that I can clearly remember now. But one detail stuck with me more than anything else. When the police checked the kitchenette, the largest knife from the rack was missing. If I hadn't recorded that short video on my phone, I'm not sure the situation would have been taken as seriously as it was. But in the end, nothing ever came from it. That was almost 20 years ago now. I have no idea where that old phone ended up. It's probably buried somewhere in a box at my parents' house, if it even still exists. But sometimes I think about it, and if I ever find that phone again, and it still turns on, I might finally watch that video one more time. What do you think was happening in that basement? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that one. This happened when I was 16, about 4 years ago. I grew up in a big suburban house my parents had bought before I was even born. From the outside, it looked completely normal, the kind of house you'd drive past without noticing anything strange. But once you were inside, there were a few odd things about the layout. The strangest part of the house was definitely the basement. It was easily the largest room in the entire place. My parents had finished it years earlier and turned it into a casual hangout area with a big sectional couch, a decent TV, and a couple of storage rooms tucked away in the back. You'd think a space like that would get used all the time, but my parents always preferred the living room upstairs. So for the most part, the basement was basically mine. There's one more detail that matters to this story: my cat, Rocky. Rocky was one of those overly friendly cats that constantly demanded attention. Because of that, my parents had a routine. Every night before they went to bed, they would put Rocky down in the basement so he wouldn't wander into their room and wake them up. Now here's where things get a little questionable on my part. The basement had a door that connected directly to the garage. Technically, it was meant to make bringing groceries inside easier. But for me, it served a different purpose. It was the perfect way to sneak people into the house. One Friday night, I invited a girl named Meline over. I remember it clearly because it was the kind of thing I definitely wouldn't have done on a school night. When we went down to the basement, I assumed Rocky was already down there like usual. I didn't really think about it, just figured he was somewhere in the back, probably asleep. So when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from one of the storage rooms, it didn't worry me. It sounded exactly like a cat moving around inside a pile of boxes. Meline tensed up a little when she heard it, but I just laughed and told her it was my cat being hyper like always. Rocky loved climbing on things and knocking stuff over, so the occasional noise wasn't unusual. We went back to pretending to watch whatever was on TV, but the sounds kept happening. Not constantly, just every few minutes. A rustle, a soft thud, something shifting among the boxes. Each time, Malene would glance at me nervously, and each time I'd reassure her that it was just Rocky exploring like he always did. I was completely calm, right up until the moment I heard scratching at the door at the top of the basement stairs. The door that led into the main part of the house, and I recognized that sound immediately. It was Rocky, scratching to get into the basement, which meant one thing: he wasn't down there with us, which also meant that the noises we'd been hearing for the past 30 minutes weren't coming from him. I didn't say anything right away, partly because I didn't want to scare Malene, and partly because I was still trying to convince myself I had somehow misheard it. But before I could even process what was happening, Malene suddenly screamed. I spun around and saw her pointing toward the dark storage area at the back of the basement. I turned just in time to see something slowly roll across the floor, a small foam football. It had clearly just been thrown out of the storage room. I didn't see anyone standing there, but there was no other explanation. Someone was inside that room. Someone had been there the entire time. Without even thinking, I grabbed Malene's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. We ran up as fast as we could, and the second we reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut behind us, making sure Rocky didn't slip down there. Everything after that became chaotic. Malene was crying, and I was shaking so badly I could barely think straight. I don't think I had ever been that scared in my life. My parents eventually realized something was wrong and called the police. A few minutes later, officers arrived and began searching the basement. While they were inside, I stood on the back deck watching the garage the entire time. I was determined to make sure whoever had been down there didn't escape. But then, something strange happened. The police finished searching the entire basement, and they didn't find anyone. No one. They checked the storage rooms, the garage, every corner of the basement. There were no signs of forced entry, and all of the basement windows were locked from the inside. One officer suggested that whoever it was must have slipped out through the garage before the police arrived. But I know that's not possible. I was watching the garage the entire time. There's only one way out of that garage to the outside, and I never took my eyes off it. If someone had come out, I would have seen them. But after searching the house, there was nothing else the police could do. My parents eventually assumed the person had somehow slipped away without me noticing. I could tell they were frustrated, especially my dad. But even now, years later, I'm completely certain about one thing. Nobody came out of that garage, which means the person who threw that foam football somehow disappeared from the basement without anyone ever seeing them leave. And to this day, none of us have any explanation for what really happened that night. If you have a theory about it, feel free to share it in the comments. If you have a theory about what might have happened there, feel free to leave it below. I always enjoy reading different perspectives. I think most kids are afraid of basements. Let's be honest, they're unsettling places. Even now, as an adult living alone, I still feel a little uneasy going down to the basement late at night to do laundry. But when I was a kid, the basement in my parents' house genuinely terrified me. Ironically, that's where all of our video game consoles were. It was the only other TV in the house besides the one in the living room and my parents' bedroom. I think I was about 9 years old when this happened. I remember being in elementary school, probably one of the last years before middle school. On weekends, I loved staying up late playing games down there. One of my favorites back then was Driver 2 on the old PlayStation. For some reason, I could never beat that game, so I spent countless nights trying again and again. But there was one rule I usually followed. I didn't like staying down there after my parents went to sleep. Just knowing they were upstairs watching TV made me feel safe, because if something scared me, I could run up the stairs and reach them in seconds. Like the house I live in now, our old family home had the laundry and boiler room in the basement. That room was the worst part of the entire place. It had no windows at all, which meant it was pitch black no matter what time of day it was. And because of the pipes and the boiler, strange noises always came from inside, even with the door closed. I'd sometimes pause my game and listen when I thought I heard something unusual. On this particular night, though, I definitely heard something. It started with the slow creaking sound of the laundry room door opening. I immediately paused my game. For a few seconds, the basement fell completely silent. Then I heard something else, a low, drawn-out groaning sound, like someone quietly moaning. And somehow, it sounded exactly like my mom. At first, I actually laughed. "Nice try, Mom," I remember saying out loud, assuming she was trying to scare me. Looking back now, even as a kid, I probably should have realized something was wrong. My mom was never the type to pull a prank like that. But at the time, I stood up and walked toward the laundry room, feeling a little braver now that I thought I knew what was going on. The doorway was open. Beyond it was nothing but darkness. The strange groaning sound had stopped. I stared into the black room, waiting for my mom to jump out and laugh or say something. Slowly, I stepped closer. And that's when I noticed something. A shape. The faint outline of a person standing inside the room. "Mom?" I said again. But this time my voice sounded a lot less confident. I took another step forward. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach drop. That wasn't my mom. I turned and ran up the stairs as fast as I could, screaming the entire way. When I burst into the living room, both of my parents were already there watching TV. They jumped up immediately when they heard me. "There's a woman in the laundry room," I shouted. I still remember the way they looked at each other when I said that. Then, without saying another word, they both ran down to the basement and slammed the door behind them. I stayed in the living room, confused and terrified, but at least relieved, knowing my parents were dealing with whatever was down there. It felt like a long time before my mom finally came back upstairs. When she did, she told me to go to my room and go to sleep. I didn't argue. The next morning, they told me the whole thing had just been a joke. Apparently, one of my mom's friends had come over and tried to scare me as a prank. They treated it like it was something funny that had gotten out of hand. At the time, I wasn't completely sure whether I believed them, but I didn't question it much. Years later, though, something strange kept happening. Every once in a while, the name Debbie would slip out in conversation. Whenever I asked who Debbie was, my parents always gave a different answer. So when I was about 14, curiosity finally got the better of me. I went online and searched a family tree database using my parents' names. I remember secretly using my dad's credit card for the subscription and then putting it back before he noticed. Among the list of relatives, one name immediately caught my attention. My mom had a sister named Debbie. When I searched her name along with my mom's maiden name, an obituary appeared. Debbie had died years earlier. I ran to show my parents what I had found and demanded they explain. I'll never forget the looks on their faces. They looked shocked and nervous. Finally, my dad turned to my mom and said quietly, "Tell him." That's my mom explained that I had an aunt who had struggled with serious issues in the past and had caused problems for several people. Because of that, they had always tried to keep her completely out of my life. According to them, that night she had somehow managed to get into the house without them knowing. They refused to tell me much more than that. Over the years, I've brought it up a few times, but my parents always shut the conversation down and insist it's better not to talk about it. I never learned exactly what they meant when they said she had hurt people. And maybe it's better that way. Every once in a while, I still find myself thinking about that night in the basement, about the voice that sounded like my mom, about the person standing in the dark laundry room, and about the question that never really left my mind. If my Aunt Debbie had already died, then who exactly was the woman I saw down there? Some questions, I guess, are better left unanswered. If you enjoyed these stories, you can leave a like. And if you're new here and enjoy real-life horror stories like this, you can subscribe for more.